Hello and welcome to the Forum. My name is Kenny Montano. I'm the pastor of Roy Bible Church in Roy, Utah, and thank you for joining us today on the Forum, which is the show that we get pastors together to hang out and talk about the issues that are going on in our society, in our culture, and try to bring light to them. Not necessarily give you all the answers. That's not something we can ever really try to do in the short half an hour that we have here on the program, but at least tell you maybe from a Christian perspective how we should begin to think about a lot of the issues that go on. And hopefully this spurs conversations in your own homes and your own churches about how to think about these things from a Christian perspective, from a Christian worldview, because that's how we want to encourage people to think. And today on the show, I'm joined by my good friend Mike Mitchell. He's pastor over at Westlake Community Church.
Right.
And together we're going to be talking about a very sensitive topic that we've dealt with a little bit on the program in previous episodes, but as always, there's always new wrinkles that come out of these things and new things that come out. And this week, what we're going to talk about is the I don't know what was it a court case, or was it more just a family farm? Or a
family farm
business
in New York State, just a few miles, I think maybe 20 miles or so, north of Albany, which I think is the state capital there, which, you know, it's very, very legally significant with the events that went on there. In any case, there was a family who owns a farm and some elaborate grounds where they rent the facility for different festivities and events, weddings, parties, fall festivals, things like that.
Yeah.
And they were contacted by a homosexual couple, lesbian couple, two women, called and asked if they could have their wedding ceremony on the grounds, wanted to reserve it. And the family said, and the article I read said that they were very gentle about it. It wasn't as if they were malicious or insulting, but they said that they would have to decline that offer because this was contrary to their views on morality and how things should be done. Although, from what I understand, they did offer to make part of their facility available for a wedding reception for this couple. They just didn't want to actually accommodate the ceremony itself.
The actual wedding itself.
Right. And as a result, they were fined by the state of New York, I think $13,000, somewhere around that. And then they also owed a few $1,000s, were made to pay a few $1,000s to the couple for the mental anguish that they had caused them. And the other detail in the story that I thought was very telling was that the couple apparently to some extent had set this up. It was a premeditated trap, for lack of a better term, because when they called to make the reservations, they actually recorded the phone call. So maybe it wasn't. Maybe that they're. I don't know. Someone could argue that they're just really sensitive because they're afraid of discrimination, so they guard themselves by regularly recording phone calls. But in any case, it was not a good situation and something that's definitely of huge concern for Christians.
Yeah, definitely, especially Christians that have businesses and particularly involved in weddings and other types of celebrations, rental facilities. I think we talked before about the cake businesses and things like that and how they should deal with it. But here is a facility rental, grounds rental. And again, and here's a case where, again, a fine has been levied. There's actually been action taken against that. And so where do we start? Again, when we hear something like this, as Christians, our natural reaction for most people, I think for most Christians I know, is to get upset and rightly so, to be disappointed in the way things are going. But where do we begin when we're having a conversation in our churches or with our families, when we are discussing this, as opposed to just anger, of course? How do we understand this, respond to it, and yet also be loving and gracious and gospel people in the midst of difficulties like this?
I think there's a very important balance. I mean, so many things in the Christian life require a very delicate balance of two seemingly opposite sides. One of the things that I think you asked the question, where do we start?
Yeah.
I think we have to start with clarifying the situation, because there are a lot of people who have been so conditioned by our culture about the issue of homosexuality that, and hopefully this would be people, if they're regular in church and in a Christian community, or new Christians and people who haven't been Christian for very long. But there are a lot of people who really don't understand that this is a very deep moral issue, and this is a sin issue. That they really have been so conditioned by our media and different views in our culture about homosexuality, they really have been taught to think and have come to think of this as something that's really tantamount to racism,
right.
or some dispute between people of different ethnicities.
That's usually what it gets compared to. I guess is a type of almost like racial discrimination between
Absolutely.
people that just have they can't help the color of someone's skin or where they were born, and
born
their
this way.
sexuality as well.
So much of the whole gay rights movement is just centered on that one argument: we were born this way.
Yeah.
We were born this way. And I think first what needs to happen in terms of Christian leaders and Christians with influence is that we need to say, let's clarify the situation. This is, without question, this is a situation where Christians are being forced by their government to violate their own conscience, to go against what they specifically believe about sexual morality. This is a moral issue if ever there was one. And we have been, as I said, so conditioned by our culture to think of homosexuality as something that's just benign and something that's completely acceptable and is no different, morally speaking, than heterosexuality. That we need to find another example to clarify the situation, to find something that people still understand as a moral issue.
Yeah.
So truly, this situation is no different whatsoever, legally speaking, morally speaking, than if you had someone who, say, owned a bed and breakfast or a hotel, and you had a prostitute come to him and say, I'm a prostitute, it's what I do for a living, it's the way I support my children, and I need to use your facility to serve one of my clients. And I'm going to pay you your full price, I'm going to abide by your rules, but I need your facility to carry out my business. And if that person, that owner, said, I'm sorry, but I can't allow you to do that because that would make me complicit in your immoral behavior. That would make me a participant in some way because I'm accommodating you and what you're doing, and I believe that what you're doing, the way you're behaving, not the way you're born, but the way you're behaving is immoral, and I don't want to be a part of that. Same thing. It's instead of prostitution, it's homosexuality. And our government says it doesn't matter whether you agree with this or not, we're going to force you to be a part of this. We're going to force you not just to tolerate it, but to accommodate it and celebrate it.
Yeah.
And I think that's very frightening. So people need to know that. They need to know that's the situation. And then the other side of the balance is, like you said, we need to understand that even though people who would do this, people who would fine Christians for obeying their Christian conscience about sexuality, are our enemies, but we know that Christ tells us to love our enemies and to pray for them. And we've got to remember that just as much as we remember the other.
And I think we also have to be careful in dealing with people that it comes off that way, that what we're trying to do is protect our Christian liberty. We're not trying to attack other people. Because I think you and I would be ones who would say we'd be in support of a gay couple who owned a facility who wanted to refuse service to other people that they felt were doing things, maybe a conservative couple who they knew were against gay marriage, and their facility, they promote that, and I think we would say no, they should have the right to do that and to be able to choose their clientele and that sort of thing. So
no doubt,
it's definitely an issue where we would support the rights. There's really a rights issue within America here that we have, as opposed to a war that Christians are waging, trying to make others feel uncomfortable.
I had a similar thought on the whole issue that's behind us now for the most part, but the issue with Hobby Lobby, when that was so prominent in the news, where people complained that this was prejudice and this was such an injustice to women that they did not want to, again, be complicit in supplying women with birth control, which would be an act that violates their conscience. And my thought on that was just as what you said. Look, if Hobby Lobby is that bad, and if this is this big of an injustice, then don't shop there. Don't work there. Don't support them in any way. And if enough people do that, they would go out of business. That's the way America should work. But it's not the way it works now. It's very, very different these days.
It's interesting how a lot of people will say things like, the government shouldn't be the legislator of morality.
Right.
But it usually And Christians have to be careful about this because it usually ends whenever it's the type of morality that you want.
Right.
Right?
Right.
You're okay with them legislating against that thing that you think is awful. But I mean, this is where we could get into discussions, legal discussions about or political discussions about the government legislating everything from smoking and to these things. How far can the government go? Because here you see that whenever we begin to allow the government to begin to legislate morality on any level and tell us what is right and wrong for the individual, not what is protecting another individual from somebody, which I guess you could make the case with smoking there with secondhand smoke and that sort of thing. But that the government's main responsibility is to protect you from me, essentially. To tell me, here's, Kenny, you can do, basically, you have freedom to do whatever you want as long as it doesn't interfere with Mike's freedoms. And the difficulty here is, here's a privately owned business, private company, family business that is being forced to do, like you said, something against their conscience simply because they choose to exercise their faith. In a way, isn't this not allowing them a free, I mean, it's really a religious exercise violation, I would think, the way I look at it, because they're not being allowed to freely exercise their own religious beliefs in their workplace because of what a court is saying. You can't exercise your religious belief in this way.
And one of the things that lies behind that is that, again, we have such a distorted and such just a messed up way of thinking when it comes to human sexuality. And again, we are so conditioned to think by the culture outside the church that sexuality is really an amoral activity. That two people having sexual relations with each other is really along the same lines as just having dinner together or sleeping or breathing or putting a shirt on or going to the bathroom. It's just this biological function that people have to engage in, and it's really something that has no moral significance. So how horrible is that you would discriminate against someone on something like that? As to where what we say, what all Christians have always said, and Jews and Muslims and so many others, is that sexual behavior is deeply moral behavior. It is profoundly morally significant. And the way you conduct yourself in that arena has serious moral consequences. So the thing that gets me about discrimination, that being the case, that this is such a morally rich issue, it's not like, and maybe it would be a whole different deal, and maybe Christians would even side with those who are fighting against discrimination against homosexuals, if it were some issue where the product or the facility that was being withheld had nothing to do with the behavior. So if you owned a grocery store and you knew that a person was outspokenly gay, and you said, well, I'm sorry, we don't serve your kind here. You can't buy food here. Well, that's different.
And we would be the first to say that's awful.
We would say that's awful. That is completely un-Christ-like. And this has nothing to do with the thing that you disagree with. But what's going on here is that, again, the government is trying to force the Christians to actually participate in that behavior and actually celebrate it and hold it up. And that's what's really frightening.
Now let's ask a different question maybe, and because again we've talked a little bit on this level a little bit before, but let's talk to the Christian business owner. And I'm sure not all Christian business owners would have reacted the same way. There's some that maybe don't see renting a facility or something like that as participation in a wedding, because they maybe we would take a different stance. Maybe say, oh yeah, if I was a photographer or a cake maker or something, I'm being forced to really use my artistic abilities to help this wedding. Where if I own a farm or a facility, I'm just kind of renting it out, and maybe I wouldn't have gone as far as this couple. Maybe they wouldn't say that couple was wrong, but should every Christian that owns a business, how should they think about participating in these types of things? Is this a black and white answer on participation, or is there a gray area here where individual discernment needs to come up?
Certainly individual discernment is key, as it is in so many cases. And I think when it comes down to it, of course, like everything else, it's going to come down between that person and God, and they're accountable to Him, not to us. Although I think that, as I was saying earlier, that at least to me, I'll just say my own opinion, that to me it seems to be a pretty clear line between events or products or issues that are directly related to accommodating of the behavior, or something that's just a general issue that all people would be in need of. I see a difference there. Like I said, is it food? Is it clothing? Is it a vehicle or whatever? Well, sure, that should never even come up. It's not even an issue. I mean, if the person is maybe not homosexual, but they're atheist, and they're maybe big groupies of Richard Dawkins or somebody like that, we should still sell them a car at a good price and be fair and conduct business with them. But this would be a case where, let's say if someone was a big flag-waving atheist, and not only do they want us to sell them something they need, but they want us to go and somehow, offer them the facility and the resources to have an atheist rally to decry Christianity or something like that. So to me, I see the line there between, again, what is and what is not directly, in support of or in accommodation of the behavior itself.
Yeah, especially if your staff and you are going to be there,
right,
participating, helping with. I mean, there's these different levels,
right. And it's interesting too. A friend of mine has a son who has a lot of tattoos, and he has tattoos on his neck and most places where his clothing doesn't obscure it. And his employer forces him to wear turtlenecks and wear clothes that cover up the tattoos. And I don't find that outrageous. I mean, that's somewhat understandable because businesses have a certain way they want to portray themselves. There are other businesses who want their employees to have tattoos because it's consistent with their public image. That's the freedom you have to conduct business. How do you want to present yourself? What do you want to be known for in the community? How do you want to put yourself out there? And obviously, this would be even more so to the.
And again, whether it's the company that makes their employees hide tattoos, or a lot of companies have policies on facial jewelry and different things like that, or the ones that allow it. If you don't approve, you have the right not to shop there or to support them, right? In that business, that's kind of the way the free market works.
Absolutely.
Is if I don't like your stand, I don't have to shop. If I don't like where the public stances your company makes, I don't have to shop there.
Right.
But it doesn't give me the right to tell you you can't have that stance.
Absolutely.
And that's the big issue is here is, again, these things are beginning to infringe upon Christian liberties. And they haven't gone so far as, I keep waiting because I think the next thing that's going to happen is there's going to be, when are we going to get to the day when churches are going to be required to host events like this?
Sure.
And I think right now that's something that nobody wants to touch in the courts and everything like that, because churches are clearly allowed to have
and
a little different step. That day may not be that far off.
Before the whole issue with the Obamacare and birth control and the Hobby Lobby case, and before these separate instances, as the one we're talking about now in New York, there was the couple who owned a bakery in Oregon. There was another in Colorado. Before these came up, I would have said, I really can't imagine that. I can't imagine the government having some sort of influence, some coercive influence on the way churches conduct themselves. And we're not there yet, like you said, but in light of these events, when the state government of New York forces this couple to pay thousands of dollars because they wouldn't accommodate a gay wedding, in light of that, I think, it's not happening now, but it's not hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And here's one thing too, before we went on to another topic, before we go on to the other topic, a question that I think is really important, and I would challenge people to consider. 100 years ago, homosexuality was literally illegal in the United States and in the United Kingdom and in England. You would literally go to prison. And Oscar Wilde was a famous playwright in Britain in the late 1900s, and he is infamous, infamous for some, famous for by others, for being put in prison. He was put in prison for a couple of years because he admitted to homosexual activity. Now, I'm not arguing that we should put people in prison for homosexual activity. I don't think that was necessarily right either. But the fact is, we've had a complete 180-degree change in our legal system and in our cultural mindset on how that is viewed. And here's a question. Why did that change? What brought about that change? Was it a very careful, deliberate, discerning, thoughtful process where people really soul-searched and gave themselves to discerning the truth on this matter? Or was it more just...
It's the frog in the kettle, hasn't kind of been...
The frog in the kettle, absolutely. And then how did the kettle get turned up to start with? Was it something where, say, to use the analogy of a ship, did they re-examine their navigation equipment and fine-tune that and set the course where it was supposed to go? Or did it just drift?
Yeah.
Was it just the winds of cultural mood and unbridled libido? You know, what has caused the change? You know, and I think that people would be really startled if they gave that some serious thought to find out that what's caused it is something that really has no authority or meaning at all. But yet,
Well, and like we've talked about before, I think, you know, here is the government in some ways saying, no, you can't legislate people's sexual morality, and yet we're still doing it though in other ways.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You know, polygamy is still illegal, although there's cases here in Utah that are challenging even that. But I think they have a firm ground based on other decisions that the government has made. If they say, you know, if gay marriage is okay, well then why not 3 people in a marriage?
Absolutely.
If gender doesn't matter, then why does number matter? Number would seem to be less significant than gender.
Right.
On a scale of things, if you
Sure.
want to be married to 4, if 4 people want to be married, why is that an invalid? If marriage can be whatever you want it to be, as long as people are consenting and in love, which is kind of what the whole argument has been,
Right.
and if that's okay, then why would the government object to any number over another number? Isn't that numerical discrimination?
And think about the things that fall under that category that would meet that criteria of being taking place between 2 consenting adults, or however many consenting adults, and involve, you know, expression of love, emotion of some sort. You could say that incest could be that way. Yeah. That can meet that criteria. Certainly, people have argued that pedophilia meets that criteria. You know, in terms of the consenting adult, certainly prostitution meets that criteria. In fact, there are counties in the state of Nevada where prostitution is actually legal, and I guess brothels that are approved by the state. But in any case, I think that, you know, it's one thing to know what people think, and it's another thing to know why they think what they think. Yeah. And when we go back and start to contemplate, how did we get from there to here? To me, it's pretty unnerving, because, again, it was not because of some concerted, sincere, moral discernment where we really wanted to repent and do right, but we just, you know, went adrift with the change in the winds of cultural mood.
And again, as Christians, we can't use, I think it's important for us to understand that we can't use the same types of arguments to argue for morality that people are arguing against morality, because ultimately we get our morality not because of what is politically expedient or not what's helpful to us or whatever, or any other reason, rather than saying we derive our sense of morality from God's Word.
Right.
And so that's important, I think, because I hear a lot of Christians, whenever they deal with these types of things and argue, they argue almost polemically in a similar way as the rest of the culture argues for their, you know, whatever their idea is. Well, this is, you know, and we have to understand that at the end of the day, we're going to be on the opposite side of a lot of issues, because simply we follow what God's Word has to say.
God alone is
and we have to be
standard.
willing to say that, to say, no,
Absolutely.
my main reason for opposing this is I follow God's Word. And so that causes us to really have to be people of the Word, people that are reading it and studying it and understanding it, so that, because at the end of the day, this is a gospel issue. So as we kind of wrap up toward the end of this episode, how do we share the gospel? How do we bring the gospel and the love of Christ for sinners into this conversation when we're talking with our friends and our family here in the last 5 minutes?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, what's really challenging about that in a situation like this is not when we're around people who don't believe in Jesus and don't accept, don't even know maybe what the gospel is, and don't accept that God's authority comes in the Bible. And that's a different deal. But when people about whom all those things are true, and at the same time are deliberately antagonistic toward us and are militant and want to force our hand, as is in this case in New York, that's difficult, because we do have to stand in love and communicate the truth in love. And remember that Jesus, as I said, tells us to pray for our enemies. But at the same time, we can't compromise. We can't allow ourselves to. So, you know, I think of this whole issue and the story about this couple in New York and all the others we've talked about. It brings to mind to me so clearly the episode in the book of Daniel where King Nebuchadnezzar raises this statue, this idol, and he demands that everybody fall down and worship it. And that's essentially what's going on here, because we're being called and basically forced to bow down at the idol of tolerance and moral relativity. Now Daniel has to be a light for God to those pagan people who don't understand who he is, but he can't do that by compromising. And he's not going to lead them to the truth by saying, well, so that they'll listen to me, I'll go ahead and bow and worship this statue.
Right.
So, we have to speak the truth in love, but we can't speak the truth in compromise, because in compromising we lose the truth.
Right.
So that's a challenge, but it is our responsibility, and we have to remember that we don't hate people, even if in a situation like this, where say we lose thousands of dollars because we stood true to our conscience. We don't harbor feelings of anger and hatred toward people. We forgive. We still, as much as we possibly can, we still love and serve and help and do our best to work for the other people's best interest. We don't hold grudges. Everything we do should be driven by and centered on hoping to get people to come to faith in Jesus Christ and come to experience the love that he gives us, not in winning an argument, and not putting ourselves on the victory stand.
Yeah.
But looking for the
because the world's biggest need is not for gay marriage to be illegal, but it's for people to know Jesus Christ as Savior.
Absolutely.
And so that's always our key, to try to look for ways, and I encourage people to do this. We encourage people to do this in our church, and I'm sure you do as well, to look for ways to turn conversation, because these are the types of conversations people are more likely to have at the water cooler, at least initially, than they are going to be launching into conversations about the historicity of the Bible or things
Right.
like, other things that we talk about apologetically in church.
Right.
But these are great opportunities to talk about, well, where does our morality come from? Why would we take a stance like that? Is it just because we find homosexuality gross?
Right.
That's not a good reason for that.
That probably is one of the most important points
Yeah.
that's been made today. I think what you just said, that the source of our morality is God, and not political correctness, not the rules of the government, not the mood that happens to be fashionable at the time. And there's one thing that popped into mind when you were saying that. Rob Bell is a very well-known pastor. Was a pastor. I'm not sure if he is now, but author, very very well-known Christian. And gifted guy, and certainly has done some good things. But I was very disappointed to hear him endorse same-sex marriage.
Right.
But I heard an interview with him, or I actually read it, and the man interviewing just asked me a question. And from what I understand, it bothered Rob Bell, and he wasn't quite sure how to answer it. And he said, "Listen, do you think that God would be pleased with two men having sex together? Do you think that God would be happy with that?" And he tried to dodge it and he said, "No, the question is, do you think that God himself would be pleased with that type of behavior?" And I think that's the question we're left with at the end of the day. That's where our morality comes from.
And it's a question for you to wrestle with. It's a question of, what does the Bible actually say about things? What does God actually believe about these things? And this is a conversation that we've talked about, but it's hopefully one that can continue to be talked about in your homes and your churches. If you want to talk to us more, you can email us at forumtv20@gmail.com or check us out on YouTube. But for Mike and for Kenny today, thank you for joining us today on The Forum.